Why do some 2D games look flat and others don't? And I don't mean flat in the way that Spelunky looks flat, because it doesn't really use parallax that much. But like, why does Hollow Knight not look flat, whereas a game like Laika is comparatively paper-like? Or to take it further, why does Gris sometimes feel flat and other times not? Well, I think your first assumption might be that as long as you have parallax and camera movement, you get that depth. But take a look at this scene from Abe's Odyssey. No camera movement, but it doesn't look flat. We can even look at this scene in Laika. No camera movement, doesn't look flat. Whereas in this scene, it starts to look flat again. The reality is that faking depth is really about not breaking the expectation of the audience. If your camera is static, you can shade your asset to look kind of 3D, and since the camera doesn't move, it will continue feeling kind of 3D. But as soon as you start moving the camera, now your brain is going to expect objects like this to separate, and when they don't, we start to realize it's all on one single layer, and that realization is the problem we need to avoid. This is why you can create a scene like this one from Cuphead with very little movement, but you get that small shift as the camera moves, and you also have one or two assets that are clearly in front of the character. To be fair, it also helps having a rotating 3D object in the background. Now the game feels fairly immersive. But in an actual game, you generally can't do this. You need the camera to move a lot, so faking depth like they've done in Abe's Odyssey doesn't really work. So how should you do it? Well, the principle is the same. It's about expectation. If something in reality is really far away, it tends to look fairly flat. But if it's close to us, it looks 3D. Take this tripod arm. Pay extra attention to each joint here and this hole. If it's close to the camera and I do comparatively small movements side to side, each of these joints shift and we get quite a bit of parallax. But if the object is far away from me, the same movement will barely create any parallax. It all looks roughly the same. This same principle applies to your game. A flat asset that is far away doesn't have to distort to look reasonable. So a game like Run with a fairly zoomed out camera doesn't really feel flat, because it looks like we're far away, so we don't expect the blocks to look that different as we move. Conversely, if we have objects that we expect to be fairly close to us, but the assets don't distort as we move sideways, well, now we have broken the illusion. The object looks flat. This is why some scenes in Gris look flat, whereas others don't. They're drawn the same, but the expectation is that this asset should distort, whereas this one shouldn't. So what does this mean for us? Well, two things. First and foremost, it's mostly the objects close to the camera or objects that are really big that we need to be careful with. Fundamentally, it also depends on the shape of the object. If we have a shape like a sign, since that object is flat, it won't distort as we move sideways, which we can compare to a bush, which is a much more three-dimensional object. In this case, the bush to the left looks more realistic, like it has more depth, compared to the bush to the right, which just looks like a flat sprite. We expect it to distort, and so when it doesn't, it feels flat. So we can see in a game like Rayman that the big foreground objects actually don't move that much. They add some movement, enough to create the illusion of depth, but not enough movement to create the expectation of distortion. This principle, however, is quite important for a different reason. Because when we do our level design, we will on occasion have areas like this one, where we see this side of the room and the other side of the room at the same time, so that we know where to go. The problem with this type of situation is that we frankly can't add that much parallax to this section in between, because the scene will break. So if we were to try this with this pillar here, we add some nice parallax, and well, it looks pretty cool. But as soon as I walk to the edge of the screen, it starts looking terribly and behaving terribly. So if I add parallax, it needs to be fairly understated, like this. Now since the layer barely moves at all, it won't become awkward as I move from here to here. This is something we see in quite a lot of games. In areas where they're allowed to showcase a lot of parallax, they do. But whenever the parallax will interfere with the level design, they basically reduce the parallax to almost nothing. But now we have a problem. Without the parallax in the foreground, we run the risk of the scene looking flat. So what can we do? Well, two things. The first thing is something we can see quite clearly in Rayman. The perspective of each asset makes the scene look more 3D. It's all drawn in a sort of diametric projection compared to a profile view of each asset. Personally, I think this view affects readability too much, even if it makes your game look less flat. Because when the asset is angled like this, it makes it difficult to judge exactly where the hitbox is. Especially compared to the same scenario where the edge of the asset is exactly where the hitbox is. But we can see this principle applied even in a game like Hollow Knight. Each asset is sometimes drawn to make it seem slightly more rounded. So even if the edge is flat, the side of the asset doesn't feel that flat. Which we can see if we compare these two assets. One clearly looks flat, whereas the other feels as if it has more depth. The next trick is something we can see in Ori. Now I don't really want to go into the discussion of Ori being 3D. In the original game, 3D models were rendered as 2D sprites, And for the purposes of this discussion, I just want to look at the small tricks we can use to make the scene look less flat. So here we have a similar scenario where we can't have that heavy parallax. But in order to mask the flatness, almost every single asset moves. This generally works quite well even when using parallax layers. If we take a scene with a big flat foreground layer, this basically screams flat foreground. But if we add a shader to it with some movement, now we get some of that added distortion, which masks the flatness of the sprite to some extent. When the assets move, they kind of stop looking flat. The second thing we can see in Ori is that whenever the level design allows for strong parallax, it uses it, just like here in Rayman or here in Ghost Song. It even goes so far as to make a point of regularly blocking the character in order to force the feeling of depth. So these are assets that are extremely close to the camera. These assets that are close to us generally also lack a lot of information. They're blurry and they're darker. The reason for this is that if we blur an asset and make it more of a silhouette, we lose the information necessary to evaluate whether the asset is 3D or 2D. So it just looks sensible. So it basically stops feeling flat. This is one of the biggest benefits to making your foreground pure black. You don't have to draw as much, and a silhouetted asset almost never looks flat. This is another reason why I generally like adding particle effects at the bottom of my assets. If we take this huge tree, and then walk back and forth, the asset clearly looks almost like paper. But if we place it further into the background and add some layers in front of it, now it looks slightly less like paper. Now if we add some particle effects at this bottom section of the tree, now the particle effects adds movement, which takes attention away from the asset. It also highlights each layer, thus highlighting the depth. The last thing it does is that it masks the flatness at the bottom of the asset. And in general, the trick of masking flatness becomes quite important. For instance, I often mention how blurring the background is important because of readability. But just take a look at this scene without blur, and then compare it to moderate blur. If we add information to evaluate, the player will evaluate it. So we get a flat look in one situation, and a less flat look in another. As soon as you add information and add expectation, you have to add layers and you have to actually add depth. And this can actually be an extremely arduous task. If we look at this scene in Laika, that looks fairly flat, the reason this looks flat is that we expect this object to move differently in relation to this object, even if that movement is slight, which we saw with our example with the gorilla pod. But in order to accomplish this, you actually need to put in a lot of work. Let's compare this scene to Aitora. The same type of city doesn't look as flat. But the reason for this is that almost every single asset is broken up into several layers. So this tree is not just one asset, it's broken up into smaller assets on different layers in order to create a tiny parallax effect and thus look slightly less flat. This is something Rayman does as well, breaking assets like this tree into smaller components in order to add parallax. And this leads us into the final question. Is it all worth it? Well, it depends. Making your character slightly less flat by drawing them in 3/4 view and ensuring that the shoulders shift back and forth is something that makes your game look less flat with basically no drawbacks. In a similar fashion, setting a context where flatness doesn't feel off is something that also basically has no downside. Like this scene, which doesn't feel terribly flat even though it is, because the scene is basically composed of stone blocks, so we expect it to look like it does, which is something that Run also benefits from. But as soon as we get into a lot of the other tricks, then we suddenly have to make some considerations. Splitting up individual assets to create depth is extremely time consuming. Adding shaders and particle effects to every single asset can absolutely ruin your performance. And hiding information in the form of blur or silhouettes works for creating the illusion of depth, but if we look at this scene which I created to talk about uniqueness, if we slap a dark foreground and blur onto this scene, now it suddenly feels a lot less unique. That is, it basically went from Grist to Hollow Knight without redrawing the scene at all. So at that point, I think for most of us, it becomes a question of picking and choosing. Some tricks are worth it and other tricks are not. Thanks for watching. Bye.